You're likely aware that there is such a thing as an optimal air-fuel ratio for power, and I'd venture to say that most people's assumption is that your motorcycle is tuned from the factory to run as close to this ratio as possible. It makes perfect sense. So what would you say if I told you that your bike actually runs lean from the factory, and it's entirely purposeful? Not only that, but because of this, the most common motorcycle mod for performance can actually make your bike perform worse in many ways. Hey, I'm Michael, and today I'm going to teach you why your bike is tuned wrong from the get-go, and why an easy mod that made out of the box power decades ago usually results in the opposite effect today. First, a refresher. What is air-fuel mixture, and why does it matter? Well, air-fuel mixture is rather self-explanatory. It's the ratio of how much air is going into your engine compared to how much fuel is going into the engine. The figure 14.7 parts air to 1 part fuel is often cited as the optimal mixture. However, the optimal mixture changes depending on what your motor is doing, what kind of motor it is, if it is naturally aspirated or uses forced induction, as well as the type of fuel. For our purposes, we'll just be talking about a naturally aspirated, street-ridden 4-stroke. As a fuel mixture strays away from the quote-unquote ideal, we use the term rich to describe a motor getting too much fuel and lean to describe a motor getting too much air. A rich, or fuel-heavy mixture results in more unburnt fuel, but typically better for power when done right, and keeps the motor cooler. A lean mixture is typically associated with running the motor hotter and not being as good for power. However, it is better for emissions. So that's all well and good, but everybody knows aftermarket exhausts are just cheap bolt-on power, right? Why would that be different on an older versus a newer bike? To understand this, let's look at older bikes. And what better example than my 1978 Kawasaki KZ650, or as I call it, the OG 636. There are a lot of striking differences between this bike and a newer one, but our main focus today is the motor. What do you notice? If you said the giant-ass cooling fins, then good observation. Liquid cooling wasn't common on motorcycles till the late 80s. And even then, there were, and still are, plenty of holdouts. Air cooling is nowhere near as efficient as liquid cooling, especially when sitting still, so naturally, we had to do something to keep these bikes cool. Well, putting an electric fan or radiator on it wasn't really cost-effective at the time, so Kawasaki, along with most manufacturers, opted to take the easy approach. Remember earlier how we learned that a rich fuel mixture helps keep the engine cooler? Well, that's exactly what they did. So older air-cooled bikes usually ran rich from the factory, and there really wasn't much regulation on this. They honestly probably could have just gotten away with putting a drain tube to pour out raw fuel directly onto the ground if they wanted. Wait, they did? Oh, unlike every bike ever made? Huh. Well, regardless, this meant that old bikes typically ran rich from the factory. So if you were to do something to lean it out, like an aftermarket exhaust, you would be getting more air to complement your already more fuel, which means more power. Now, let's go back to the modern day with what we learned. Nowadays, we do care about the planet a little bit more and have made small sacrifices to help reduce emissions, like not burning lead or dumping raw fuel on the ground, and enacting other strict emissions regulations. We now find ourselves in the exact opposite situation as before. We have liquid cooling, and keeping the bikes cool is now not an issue at all, but emissions are very heavily regulated unlike before. Why not bust out all reliable and change the mixture? So that's exactly what they do. I will take this moment to point out that there are a few street bikes that are air-cooled but also don't run too rich to fail emissions. I will use my CB1100 as an example. So how did they make a big displacement air-cooled bike pass emissions? Well, to drastically oversimplify this, more power usually means more heat and vice versa. So if you really want to make a nostalgic air-cooled bike that doesn't overheat but also passes emissions, you kind of need to sacrifice power. And oh boy, did they. This 1100cc inline 4 makes under 90 wheel horsepower, which is about equivalent to the new Honda CB750 Hornet, which is a parallel twin 750cc. These bikes are also typically fitted with oil coolers, which are very similar to what we think of when we think of a radiator, but for oil instead of coolant. And while the CB1100 is still a fun bike to ride, we can easily see why manufacturers much prefer to make power out of a water-cooled bike and just run it lean instead. This leads us into a trap, however, because exhausts are still seen as bolt-on power in pop culture, even though the reason they used to be is no longer true. So if bikes run lean from the factory and people install an aftermarket exhaust, what happens? Well, it depends on the bike and other factors, of course, but it's not good for your bike regardless. Leaning out your bike causes a few side effects like loss of power, more jerky throttle, and backfiring. This is not to say you can't or shouldn't get an aftermarket exhaust, but if you do, it is important to tune your bike for it. Running too lean or rich is not good for a motor, and while slightly one side or the other is always going to happen in the real world and isn't the end of your motor, extremes can cause real damage and headaches. If you're not very technical and want to look for signs that your bike is running lean, the easiest way to tell is to listen for some burbles on deceleration and or look at your exhaust headers to see if the pipe is bluing any. A little bit is normal on an aftermarket exhaust right next to the motor, but a lot of bluing is indicative of a lean and hot condition. It is the excess heat that causes this bluing of the metal. But wait, my bike is fuel injected. My bike's ECU will automatically richen the bike if I put an exhaust on it, right? Well, not really. Most motorcycles use narrowband exhaust sensors, unlike the car world which use wideband sensors more commonly. Your bike's ECU is trying to keep your motorcycle running as emissions compliant as it can, and it will adjust slightly for altitude, air density, and weather, but can't make a change drastic enough to account for an aftermarket exhaust. Furthermore, depending on the bike, it's unlikely that your ECU is making any active adjustments unless you're within a certain RPM range, as otherwise it'll just use the factory map regardless of your mods. If you found this helpful, a like is much appreciated, and if you want to see my moto adventures, projects, or just want some more educational videos, then a subscription is well worth it and it means the world to me. As always, thank you so much for watching, rubber side down, and I will see you next time.